Hey everybody, this is Ben dropping you a quick note. Our editors have been working hard to get episodes finished to release on schedule with the reading of the week. Our hope is that listeners will have the chance to engage with the content and share meaningful ideas in their circles of family, friends, and church. In order to meet this goal, this episode has been released with minimal editing. We are looking for additional volunteers to join the team and help with editing, social media management, and content creation. If you are interested, please reach out to us on Facebook or email latterdaypeacestudies@gmail.com. You can also donate to the project, helping us cover the costs of things like website hosting and podcast platform fees. Donations can be made through PayPal by going to our website, latterdaypeacestudies.org, clicking Get Involved, and scrolling down to the donate box. Thanks so much to all who have helped out and donated over the years. We are sincerely grateful. Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me as outlined by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our hope is that as we discuss the Scriptures, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives. Welcome to Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm your co-host, Christopher Hurtado. With me is my co-host, Ben Peterson. Hello, Ben.
Hi, Christopher.
This week we are covering sequential chapters, which we're pretty excited about. We don't get to do this often. It's chapters 7 through 10 of John. And Ben's making me introduce it. So what are we talking about this week, Ben? This week we're talking about Jesus's confrontations, many arguments, lots of antagonism with quote unquote the Jews, which translates Judaioi, which could mean the Jews, or it could mean the Judeans. So I don't think we should think of it as Jews in general, just Judeans, and maybe even more so specifically the authorities, right? The authorities among the Judeans. We have the story of the woman taken in adultery, which is unique to the Gospel of John. We have the Good Shepherd, the parable of the Good Shepherd. We have the living waters. We have Jesus, even his not even getting along with his brothers. We have all kinds of stuff going on. Let's go into this, Ben, starting with chapter 7. Right off the bat, we get him traveling around in Judea, and the Judea are looking to kill him. And there's the festival, right? The pitching of tents festival, Sukkot, right? This is the Feast of Tabernacles. It's a reminder of the time that the Jews were in the wilderness, right? And Jesus is saying he's not going to go. And it's required of all men to go. But he says he's not going. But then he goes. He sneaks off. He just doesn't want to go with his brothers. Do you know why, Ben? Why doesn't he want to go with his brothers?
Well, there's some interesting dynamic going on here. You know, his brothers are saying, hey, go up to Jerusalem. You need to, if your point is that you want everybody to listen to you, then you need everybody to see you and see what you're doing and all this stuff. And Jesus says, well, it's not my time to go up and openly declare myself because, you know, the implication from verse 1 is that they're trying to kill him. And he's saying it's not time for me to die. And so I'm not going to go up and declare myself openly. So, you know, he goes up anyway and does it. But I guess the implication here could be that he was telling his brothers, I'm not going to go openly and do it. I'm not ready for that. But you should go up. But there's obviously some tension here between him and his brothers. The verses say that his brothers don't believe on him. And so when they're saying all this stuff you're doing, all these miracles and everything, you need to go show them off. To me, it's almost like they're mocking him because they don't believe in him, right? They're saying, hey, if you really believe this, you need to go up and show off, right? They're kind of teasing him almost.
Yeah, once again, in Rudin's translation, we have not even his brothers, in fact, trusted in him. So we're talking about trust here. Belief is an assent, right? It's a choice. You check off the box. I choose to believe. I believe, right? They lack trust. And that's what this is about. When he's in Jerusalem, the Judaioi are amazed, saying, in Rudin's translation, how did this man come to be literate when he never studied? Jesus responded by saying to them, my teaching isn't mine. It belongs to the one who sent me. But if someone's willing to do what he wills, he'll know about the teaching, whether it comes from God or whether I'm speaking for myself. The thing that stood out to me about this story is it's typical. We see this a lot, right? That the new religious leader or the new religious founder is thought to be illiterate and somehow knows things that he shouldn't be able to know, right? We see that in this story. We see it in the story of the prophet Muhammad. We see it in the story of the prophet Joseph Smith, right? Joseph Smith's own mother was the one who put forth the story that he was illiterate. The prophet Muhammad was a businessman. He had to know at least how to keep accounts, right? He was working with his wife, Khadija, who was a businesswoman. The prophet Joseph Smith was very literate, very highly literate. It's clear in studying what he knows and what he read or could have read. I'm thinking of early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, Ben, by D. Michael Quinn. D. Michael Quinn goes into all of the books that would have been known to Joseph Smith, everything that's on sale around the corner from him at the bookstore, whatever's being sold door to door, what everybody knew and read, how it's obvious that Joseph Smith knew all this stuff. You and I have talked about on this podcast about how so many ideas that that Latter-day Saints might think are unique to Latter-day Saintism are actually found in the Apocrypha. And clearly Joseph Smith knew his Apocrypha. But we get these stories, right, of the illiterate religious founder. And so they're kind of surprised. How does he know stuff? And the point is, they're speaking from their own authority, right? They are the authors, not the readers of these things.
And to me, one of the points here isn't, I think when we say illiterate, sometimes we think can't read or write, right? But illiterate doesn't just mean that. Like, it can mean something, less intense. It can mean something, just not well read, right? Not acquainted with all the literature and so forth. So the fact that Jesus wouldn't know how to read and write isn't really the question here. The more the question is, he's not versed in all the rabbinical law teachings, right? In all the commentary and what all of this means, right? So how is it that he is giving all this commentary on scripture when he hasn't really gone through all of the studying that a rabbi should go through, right? That's the idea.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to push back a little bit and just say the only point to learning how to read, it is a priestly thing to do, to read and write, right? So the only point to reading and writing would be to read the law, right? To read the Torah. That's the point. And so then Jesus mentions in verse 18 that someone is truthful and that there's no lawlessness in him. I know that this is translated differently in King James Version, right? I'm reading from Rudin again. The term here is translating something like unjust, right? So we've talked about righteousness being like dikaiosune, right? And this is adike, and so it's unrighteous. It's unjust. Unrighteous is probably what King James reads, right?
Unrighteousness.
And so the next interesting thing to me, Ben, I thought was really interesting, verse 24. Jesus says, don't render a verdict merely by what first meets your eye. Instead, render a lawful verdict. And so this just reminded me of, again, he really knows the law, right? But this goes beyond that. This goes underneath the law to the purposes and intents of the law. I thought of what in Sharia is called maqasid in the Islamic tradition, maqasid al-Sharia, which is the purposes and intents of the law. In English, this would be something like jurisprudence or philosophy of law. So the question is, what was the purpose of this law? Because when you want to apply the law, and you want to do it right, to render a lawful verdict, as Jesus is quoted here saying, then you have to find out what is the purpose of the law. So I'll give an example from Sharia, right? There are these had punishments, these punishments like cutting off hands for stealing. Now, I don't want to go into this too much, but you don't actually have to sever a hand to cut off someone's hand. There's a story of a caliph's brother who stole from the treasury. The caliph exiled his brother who stole from the treasury. Therefore, his hand is cut off from the treasury, and no one's hand was severed, right? But the point is, though, even if it is interpreted as severing a hand, these kind of punishments were never carried out in times of famine. The scholars, right, the legal scholars in Islam, they realize that would be unjust, right? That would go contrary to the purpose of the law. And so you wouldn't end up with a Jean Valjean, thinking of Les Mis, right? Who has to steal bread and gets in trouble to eat, right? To survive, and gets in trouble with the law. So then we have the part where Jesus says, starting around verse 31, there's a lot of controversy in these chapters. Is he the one? He's done this, but so here you have, when the actual Messiah comes, is he going to perform more miracles than this, or is this, enough to call him the Messiah? What's going on, right? They're not sure.
Yeah, the authorities of the time here, these Pharisees or the Jewish authorities, they're very concerned with this fulfillment of Scripture. Where is he coming from? The real Messiah, you won't really know exactly where he's from. But then at the same time, they say, oh no, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. And so there's this contradiction here. It's like, wait, do you know where he's from, or do you not know where he's from? And it's kind of this confusing thing. But then they're like, well, Jesus is from Galilee, and there's no prophet out of Galilee, so that's not possible for him to be the Messiah. So anyway, there's this controversy about his identity. And that's the big discussion here. Jesus' identity. And as Messiah, or as the Son of God, Jesus says some enigmatic, difficult to understand things for the Pharisees. He's speaking in sort of like Christological or metaphorical ways. They take it literally. They don't understand. These next verses here Jesus is saying, you won't be able to come where I go. And, it's kind of this very strange, again, enigmatic teaching. And they're like, in verse 35, whither will he go, that we shall not find him? Will he go into the dispersed among the Gentiles and teach the Gentiles? And so this happens often, especially in John, where you have these antagonists, these people who are saying things that they think are counterpoints, but they're ironically speaking truths, sort of foreshadowing something that's going to happen later, which there is going to be preaching to the Gentiles, which again, in the context of the Gospel of John being written, this has already happened. The Gentiles have already been preached to, right? So when there's this story, this narrative being drawn of Jesus' discussion with the Jewish authorities of the time, sometimes you put words in the mouth of the Jewish authorities that foreshadow some future event. And it's this ironic sort of mechanism tool for teaching the narrative.
Yeah, that's interesting. So he's going to go teach the Greeks. They want to know, is he going to go teach the Greeks, right? The Gentiles? And so then in verse 37, on the last day of the festival, I just wanted to point out, it says that he cried in the King James, but which, by the way, it's obvious. I don't think anyone would read it as he had tears flowing or welled up in tears.
Not weeping, right? Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, I'm not sure that they would read it as Rudin translates it. He shouted, right? He shouted these words. If someone trusts in me, right? And so he says, if someone trusts in me, then they're going to have living water. And then he says it about the life breath, right? Which those who trust in him would receive the life breath, the pneumatos, right? Which is probably translated Holy Spirit, right? King James?
Holy Ghost, yeah.
Holy Ghost, yeah. Which we said are not really distinguishable in King James, one from the other.
Sure. And that verse 39, where there's the Holy Ghost, is kind of in parentheses, right? This is a parenthetical comment on the words of Jesus. This he spake of the Spirit, which they that believe on him should receive. For the Holy Ghost was not yet given, because that Jesus was not yet glorified.
And we hear echoes, too, of Old Testament, Hebrew Bible passages in these verses, too. And, we have in the standard works, we have lots of cross-references. Some of them make more sense than others, and yet there's so many more references. One thing you'll see reading some of these other translations is when somebody's quoting, when Jesus or someone else is quoting from the Hebrew Bible, you'll have an indentation. It shows up as a block quote, and you'll get a reference where it's coming from. And as I mentioned last week, I have now a Jewish annotated New Testament. It shows me even more of the cross-references, right, of where this is coming from, relating it back to the Hebrew Bible. And so then we have the controversy in verse 42, Ben. You mentioned already the anointed one is supposed to come from the seed of David, from Bethlehem, where David lived. And then we have a question of whether any of the leaders have come to trust in Jesus. In verse 49, we read, but this crowd doesn't know anything about the law. They're cursed. What do you think it means to be cursed for not knowing anything about the law?
Well, I think we could look at this a couple ways. Like, what do we think the text is meaning about this, or what might it mean really, like, metaphysically, for a person to be cursed for not knowing the law? In the sense here that Jesus is talking, we're going to get to this next with the woman taken in adultery, right? The idea here that they know the law well enough to use it to condemn, but they don't know it well enough to use it to bless, right? And so that's where the cursing comes in. Like, you know all the ways that the law can be used to injure other people, but you don't know it so well that you understand how it can bless others, how it provides mercy. And this is kind of going back to the statement Jesus says earlier, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And so I think that could be one of the ways that we can say here that when you don't know the law, you're cursed. It's like you know enough to be dangerous with something, right? When you have a superficial understanding of something, it's maybe even worse than having no understanding at all, because then you kind of think that you understand when you don't.
Yeah. It's interesting, your interpretation, Ben. I really like that answer, because what's being translated here, curse, is kakalogeo. It's literally to speak bad. And so it's about interpersonal interactions. In English, we would say, bad mouthing, insulting. So these are good translations, and they go along with what you said too. So an actual curse in the Greek scriptures would be more like offering up or praying over. As Rudin has it, this suggests the pagan human sacrifices that monotheistic moralism had always opposed. And that foreshadows something else we're going to talk about today when we get to the story of the woman taken in adultery, which is mimetic violence. And then, of course, we get that comment you mentioned already that, there can't be a prophet from Galilee. There is one exception. Do you remember, though, Ben, the exception?
Mm-mm.
The buffoonish, as Rudin has it, Jonah.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Jonah is from Galilee.
How about that?
How about that? That is an interesting thing. Yeah.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. Why is that, Ben? For the listener who doesn't get it right away.
Well, to me, it's interesting in a couple ways. One, because the story of Jonah is most likely not like historical, right? It's just, it wasn't intended as historical when it was written. This is meant to be like maybe historical fiction. If you want to, this is a tale of yonder years, right? But Jesus does reference Jonah a couple times, the sign of the prophet Jonah, and the idea that Jonah would go to the Gentiles, right? He's going to a Gentile city, and when he preaches to them, they repent in sackcloth and ashes, right? This is all sort of a commentary on the Israelite state where they are unrepentant. And so that is kind of, Jesus references this multiple times, saying the sign of the prophet Jonah. We often take that to mean resurrection, but the other way that can be taken is that his message is going to be taken to the Gentiles, and they're going to receive it, right? And so the idea that Jonah is from Galilee, like Jesus, but he wasn't accepted maybe by his own people, or rather he was accepted by the Gentile people, is, anyway, to me, that's an interesting sort of parallel there.
That is interesting, yeah. So at chapter 8 now, at the top of the chapter, we get the story of the woman taken in adultery.
So this story, Christopher, is one that we have referenced in the podcast for years, right? And here we're finally coming to. It's unique to the book of John. And I had come across this idea prior to actually getting into the New Testament, but especially when we're reading all the books and preparing for this year, it became apparent that this story, right, wasn't part of some original manuscript of the book of John, but it was added later. Exactly when isn't clear. It interrupts this narrative of the story of Jesus basically having a discussion/argument with these Pharisees or Jewish religious authorities. And so it really doesn't fit in the flow of the narrative when you actually look at you get to the end of the story, and then it kind of like goes back into his whole argument with these religious authorities again. And so it was added at some point, And I don't think it was even added in the right spot, but this is where it is. So we get to discuss it here.
Let's do it.
So as the story goes, they bring a woman who's taken in adultery, he says, right? Or they say, and they present her to Jesus and say, hey, she was taken in adultery. We have witnesses. Moses says we're supposed to stone her. What should we do? Right? And Jesus kind of doesn't respond right away, lets things kind of simmer, as it were.
This is important.
And then he says, hey, okay, he who is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone, or let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And kind of, that's an important point there. And so then they all kind of are there, and it's simmering some more. And then it says they went one by one, beginning with the eldest, and they leave. So obviously I emphasized a few details in this story that we're going to talk about. But as we were studying this, looking at some commentary on this, Christopher, we realized that there's a whole lot of depth, at least with the commentary on this story, that goes into psychology and religiosity and all that we won't exhaust, right? We won't get into all of this. We're going to talk about a few of the points, but one of the things that it brought up to me was that, you know what, there's so many of these stories in the Bible and then in the New Testament we've been talking about that there is a lot of depth and commentary on that we could go into. And we often are barely scratching the surface when we do it. And on this one, we're going to try to get a little bit more to the heart of the concept. But I will say that there's whole pieces of this commentary that we won't even mention, we won't even talk about, that can be explored by people. There's books and books written on this. So,
and other parts that we may mention but not go into fully, right?
Right.
So it just so happens that while you were pondering the casting of the first stone and the meaning of that, I was finally got around to reading René Girard. Now, for those who don't know René Girard, he is an anthropologist and literary theorist who gave an explanation of violence as mimetic. Now, Riley had brought up doing an episode of Latter-day Contemplation on his ideas, on René Girard's ideas, and then we got an interview. We've lined up an interview, so this is coming. We're going to have Mark Sterling on the show. He and Scott Burton interviewed René Girard and wrote for Dialogue, Scandals, Scapegoats, and the Cross, an interview with René Girard. The long and short of Girard's ideas, to be able to go into how they apply in this story, is the idea that as humans, we desire in a way that is mimetic. In other words, that's imitative. So, of course, we have hunger and therefore we desire food, but whether we desire falafel or whether we desire pancakes or hummus for breakfast, right? It depends on what we see the people around us doing. And so there's this tendency to want what other people want. This then brings us into conflict with others, at least potentially, right? It brings us into competition for the same things. And then there can be conflict. And when this conflict becomes, let's say, a plague, right? When it spreads, when it's this contagion, right? This is something satanic. And we'll go more into Satan and what that means. But at some point, it can become strife for the entire community, right? And you can call this a plague. And Girard goes into stories like Oedipus Rex, where I assume the plague in Athens and Oedipus Rex would be something like the bubonic plague. And yet it could be a social phenomenon, just like we've talked about Jesus healing and that being a social phenomenon, and actually plays into this story too. We also have the possibility that you could heal an entire community. And so what happens in the scapegoating mechanism is the idea that it is better that one man should perish, right? And so what happens is the community coalesces around an innocent victim who they somehow convince themselves is the guilty party for what's happening to them. And this brings them together. And now the strife that was between them goes away. They become united in their opposition to this one victim, And usually this one victim gets killed. Now, by the way, this victim had the power to bring a whole community into strife, and through dying to then end the strife in the community. And so that's just not an ordinary person who can do those things. So that must be something divine, right? So then this person gets divinized. And so there are stories, and I'll share one from Apollonius of Tyana. I've mentioned Apollonius of Tyana before. I mentioned that there are people going around healing people in Galilee, just like Jesus. They become divinized. This is one of them, right? This is Apollonius of Tyana. You can read about him in Philostratus. There was a plague, meaning there was strife in the community. Apollonius goes to a place where there's actually a statue of the god of Heracles, and there's a beggar there. And the beggar is just on his knees, begging for food, begging for mercy. And Apollonius says, stone him, to the people who are gathered there, to the crowd. And they don't want to stone him. How can they do such a, why would they kill this guy, this poor beggar, right? And so he says, the gods are angry because of him. And so it's still, and this is where we get into the first stone, right? It's still, would you throw a stone? But I wouldn't, I mean, at this point, we need a model, right? You need someone to throw the first stone, and then it becomes easier for someone to imitate the violence to throw the second stone. And the more stones are thrown, the easier it becomes to throw more stones. In the end, he's dead under a pile of stones. That tends to be now an altar, or it can be a place, right, of worship. You have already Heracles there, so this story doesn't go all the way in that way. This beggar doesn't become divinized. You already have Heracles, but it's sort of a similar story to, there are many other stories like this, right? But sometimes they differ in their details. So that there's that difference in detail. Once he's dead, once the beggar's dead, Apollonius points out, he says, look at the animal you've killed. And they look at the animal they've killed, and he's a dog, right? But he's the size of a lion, and he's foaming at the mouth like a dog. And they see this, right? And so there's a sense in which they have otherized, even dehumanized, and convinced themselves somehow that this person is not a person, but an animal, right? And worthy of death, the cause of all our strife. And this is the scapegoat mechanism, as Girard describes it, or at least as I would describe what Girard describes.
So the idea here, Christopher, is that the people collectively are able to decide and focus their animosity or frustration with reality into an individual. And then when they can punish that individual, it relieves their sense of unease about the situation or about reality, because now the guilty party has been punished. The cause of all of this problem has been dealt with. And so now we can move on.
And now the problem is solved until next time. Right. Yeah. And that's the problem, is that violence. So on the one hand, you're ending the endless retribution, right? Vengeance upon vengeance upon vengeance, right? You're putting an end to that, but then
only temporarily.
Right, only temporarily, exactly. Ultimately, you've quote unquote solved the problem through violence, and violence doesn't actually solve anything. And so that's where Girard is going to say the Christian message is different from myth. He points out that scholars have compared mythology and Christianity, and they did it to say, look, Christianity is just another version of these same myths. Now, they do look a lot alike, and Girard will admit that. But he says what makes the difference in Christianity is identifying with the victim. In other words, at least somebody, right? They're the followers of Jesus in this story. They don't actually fall for it. The scapegoat, Jesus is showing the scapegoat mechanism doesn't work, and they get it. Because for the scapegoat mechanism to work, everybody has to fall for it. If not everybody fell for it, it doesn't work. And so when they identify with Christ as an innocent victim, right, not worthy of death, not the cause of the problems, the game's up.
Okay, so the difference is how people perceive this victim who has been killed or stoned or whatever in this process. if even after the process is done, they still consider that was where the guilty party was, that was the cause of the problem, and we solved it by violence, that means they're accepting violence as the solution to the problem, so that if the same sort of problem arises again, that means our violence can solve it. Whereas the Christian message is that, no, we identify with the victim who was innocent, and violence was cast on them, right, committed against them, and that doesn't solve the problem. So This whole story is actually a rejection of, or an argument against, violence as a solution to the problem.
Now, when you say this whole story, Ben, do you mean the Bible?
No, the narrative of the mimetic violence, right? The narrative of the scapegoat.
I would say it's the story of the New Testament too, and it may even
it could be that too. Sort of the meta story there. Sure.
Yeah, and it may be the story that we're dealing with here, the woman taking adultery. Let's see if we can apply some of these ideas to this story, focusing first on casting the first stone.
Yeah, this is a fascinating part here to me. And again, the more that I read the commentary and kind of pondered on this concept, the more that it came out. And I'm going to try to not simplify it, but condense it, maybe, in the sense that, because there's so many aspects to this. But the idea here is that Jesus is inviting them. He's not discounting the fact that this woman may in fact be guilty of the sin. But what he does is he invites them to consider, okay, who among us, or who individually, believes they're without sin and can cast this first stone. Now, he's not actually wanting someone to cast the stone, right? He's wanting them not to cast the stone, right? So it's like the opposite of that Greek story where he was trying to get them to, at first they didn't want to, but then he was trying to get them to do it. Jesus is doing the opposite. They want to, or at least they're expressing that desire, but he's trying to get them not to do it. And the idea here is that he requires that they self-reflect. So he takes that moment. He doesn't respond immediately, right? There's that space between intention and action where the people have to reflect. They have to contemplate in some way.
And Ben, that's an important space because, as Viktor Frankl pointed out, that's that space between stimulus and response is our ultimate freedom. That's agency, right? And he's following the Stoics, by the way. Epictetus said the same thing, right? It's not what happens to you. It's how you don't have a choice about that, right? It's how you respond. That's where your choice is.
Yeah, and at issue here is that as soon as someone does cast a stone, everyone else is going to feel immediately that it is something they can do. Why? Because of that mimetic violence that you talked about. The idea that, oh, they have somebody that demonstrated this action, how it's actually to be done. That person did it. That means I can join in. I'm justified in doing it as well because I desire this and I just had a model for how it's done. This person threw the stone and hit her with a certain degree of force in a certain place, right? I'm going to try to mimic that. I'm going to try to emulate that. And when that doesn't happen because nobody can see themselves, they can't picture themselves picking up a stone and actually doing it. So they can't move into that point of action of the violence. Then they all, one by one, go away. Again, because there isn't a first follower here. I remember, Christopher, something years ago that I was watching about this concept of the first follower, that it's not the person who presents the idea that's the true leader, right? It's the first person that follows that idea, that gets on board with it. And not that was sort of presented in a positive light, like the first follower is the most courageous. They're the one that is going to, really first spark the idea and bring others with it. Because before it has a follower, it's just some crazy guy talking, right? But here it's presented in sort of the negative light, right? The first person to throw the stone, they're sort of that first follower, but in a negative sense, right? They're going to sort of open the floodgates and allow other people to follow in their path because they're all possessed with maybe what we would call a mob mentality or this, like we said, mimetic violence intention.
And since the role of Satan here, which I actually skipped somehow, is to be the accuser, right? Then what they're doing is actually satanic, right?
Hmm.
And in Girard's way of looking at this, he seems to be saying that Satan isn't really, he says Satan doesn't have any actual existence. His existence is parasitical. We're used to think of his existence as parasitical off God, but it's also off of us,
Yeah.
And so that's something that Satan is sort of a mode of being, I would say. You could think of it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Mode of being. We've also talked about, as a role, that someone plays, or a mentality that someone enters where they become an accuser, right? And here we have not just accusers, but Jesus is saying, okay, if you really believe that, act on it. If you truly believe that this is what the law says, you believe the law, and she really has committed adultery, all right, act on it. Follow your beliefs. And they can't bring themselves to do it. And I think that is the moment where Jesus is trying to present to them the fact that the way that they interpret the law doesn't work. And they need to look at it differently. They need to consider what he's actually teaching, because the way that they are interpreting the law doesn't work.
It goes contrary to the purpose of the law, perhaps, right? Again, thinking of jurisprudence.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting to note as, historical context for this story. First of all, this is the actual practice of stoning adulterers, right? That maybe in the law wasn't actually practiced by this point, if it ever was, right? It's not something that's usually done. It's even hard to even have witnesses, right? More than one witness, two witnesses, right? Who have seen the actual act.
Right.
And then, by the way, when he's saying, okay, so you're the ones who have to, because it was required by the law that the ones who were the witnesses, they had to be the first ones to cast the stones. Nobody else saw this, right? So they're the model in this story. They were the witnesses. They have to be the model in casting the first stone. And so Jesus is telling them, okay, so you're bringing her and accusing her. Now you have to be the ones to cast the first stone. You don't get to be the ones who simply follow in the mob violence, right? Without thinking about what they're doing, believing that this is somehow going to solve the problem, right? If whatever the problem, however you imagine the problem to be. And so it's also interesting to note that it was illegal in Rome, right? This is Roman law they're under, and they couldn't actually do this anyway. Right. And so when they come to Jesus, they know all these things, right? And yet the law says, "What do you say?" They say to him. And one of the key points that I want to pause on a little bit here, meaning I want to come back to it so we can further reflect on it, is the idea that Jesus creates space for them to think. Because the way this scapegoat mechanism works is it has to be, you can't actually think that you're doing it, because if you think you're doing it, it doesn't work. You have to think that you're actually, that the scapegoat is an actual cause, right? Is the actual cause of the problem. Right? You can't think of him as a scapegoat. That doesn't work.
It has to be impulsive. Right.
Right. It has to be impulsive.
Yeah. You think about those things that are, all the stuff that grocery stores put at the checkout line, right? Why do they put those things there? Because those are the most impulsive buys that people make. They just get them without thinking. They just grab it and throw it on the thing, right? They don't reflect necessarily. They don't have time to go all the way to the back of the store and get it and thinking about it as they're walking up to the register the whole time. And by the time they get up to the register, they're like, you know what? I don't need this bag of chips. And they just set it to the side somewhere so somebody has to put it away, right? That's the idea I'm thinking of here. Like there's this time for reflection. It can't be an impulsive thing.
Yeah. And so I didn't want to interrupt you when you were telling the story, Ben, but I thought to myself when you said, he asked them a question, and he kind of slows things down. I don't remember how you put it, but I thought, and that's when the game is up on the whole scapegoat mechanism. It just doesn't work anymore at that point. And so I think that this lens, this theory of mimetic violence gives us a good way to look at this. And I think we'll probably talk about Girard more moving forward.
Yeah. Got some interesting ideas. One other point about this story, I read a lot of different commentary and I've heard different commentary about the statement here that Jesus bends down and writes on the ground. And
Right.
some of the things say, they kind of speculate what he's writing or whatever. But the commentary that I was reading in my study Bible made an interesting point. They're saying it may not be so much important what he was writing, but that he was writing. Okay. The idea here being is that Jesus is demonstrating that he is educated. He understands Torah. He's studied Torah. He can write. And so when they have just said to him, Moses commanded us in the law to do this. And Jesus is bending down without saying anything, right? He also, one of the points that Gerardus makes is that he doesn't look him in the eye. He's bending down because he is avoiding looking at them in the eye, because that in their moment of frenzy or, intentional violence, right, can actually incite more. So he's kind of not looking at them in the eye. He bends down. He writes. Again, this is demonstrating, I know how to read and write. I understand. I've studied Torah. I know what the law says, right? I'm not ignorant of these things. You don't have to teach me. And again, this makes them reflect, makes them think about something else rather than the intentions they have, either to trip him up or to actually harm this woman.
Ben, I'm really glad you brought up Jesus not looking the accusers, the woman's accusers in the eye, because that's another part of the Apollonius of Tyana story that I left out that actually turns out to be relevant here. Because so you get the first stone, right? Apollonius convinces somebody to throw a stone, and then the second one comes easier. It starts to precipitate, right? It starts to become more and more people, and then everybody all at once, right? But here's what happens. So you get a stone, you get a second stone, and somewhere right in there, 2 or 3 stones, and the beggar looks up and they make eye contact with him, and they see some kind of, oh yeah, he's demon possessed, right? They see that. That's something that they imagine. And so that we can see how that happens, right? People, oh, he looked at me. Why'd you look at me like that, right? What do you mean? I just looked at you, right? So we imagine that somebody, that look meant something when someone just looked at us, right? It happens all the time. So he avoids that. And this is when the stones really start to fall on the beggar in the Apollonius of Tyana story, is once he looks up and they interpret his look as somehow defiant, right? And they see him as demon possessed. And
indicative of guilt. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So I think that's relevant to the story where Jesus doesn't look up. He's giving them space and time to think, causing them to, right? Slowing things down, and then not doing anything. He's just passive, right? In a sense. Now, it's interesting because you point out so many people have speculated about what he writes. Rudin has. He wrote down, but Jesus bent down and he wrote down a formal summons with his finger on the ground. And I thought, really, a formal summons? It's not in the Greek. I thought,
why would she translate it that way?
I don't know. Yeah,
That's
she's
strange.
Yeah, she's really, really reliable, and yet sometimes I get this, something like this.
So what does she mean by that? What is a formal summons?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Sorry to ask you something you don't.
I don't know. I really don't know. Yeah, it's okay.
The last part about this story I want to mention, Christopher, is the part where they one by one leave, right? Because Jesus invites them, right, rhetorically, to cast stones one by one, is essentially, right? The one who doesn't have sin, be the first to cast a stone. So the idea would be one person would, then another person would, then another person. So one by one, they would start casting stones. But the opposite happens. One by one, they walk away, right? Beginning with the elders, it says. And that is an interesting point. You have these people who are more experienced. They're reflecting on their own lives, realizing they've made a lot of mistakes as well. They're not without sin, and they're walking away. Whereas you might get to the younger people who are a little more self-righteous, idealistic, more ready and active, impulsive, and it takes the actions of these elders one by one walking away to start sort of dispelling and calming the situation.
And there it is again, mimesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
They imitate. The last thing I want to say about this story, well, it's not really a statement, it's a question I want to bring up. Where's the man?
Right.
A woman was taken in adultery. Really, where's the man?
Yeah.
We don't have to answer that question. I just thought I'd bring it up. Do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, the only thought here is that if we're trying to, like, if we were going to make a movie, right, and we had to have the whole backstory to everything, right, then the way that you would have to make this work is the man would have to be Roman, right, so that they wouldn't be able to have any power, a religious authority over him to do anything. That's all I can think of.
That's interesting.
So right after this story, we go back, we kind of shift back to the narrative that this had interrupted. And Jesus is again having his legal argument with these religious authorities. Now, one of the reasons that this story might have been put where it was is because thematically it does sort of match with this legal arguments that he's having. Yeah, the sparring with the authorities, right? But just with the flow of the narrative, it doesn't quite fit. But in any case, you know, when we, in verse 12, when we get back into this previous narrative, he's again having this argument with these religious authorities over his identity. And it becomes a little more legalistic in a certain sense. And Jesus calls two witnesses to his identity, and they're himself because of his works and God, right? And this is quite rhetorical and quite, what's the word? Confident.
It's quite logically sketchy.
Yeah. Right. Right.
But that's what he says.
Yep.
And then they ask him, because he mentions his father, where's your father? And Jesus answered, you don't know either me or my father. If you knew me, you would have known my father too. So it's interesting because remember the Jewish establishment's claiming that Jesus is born out of wedlock, right? And falsely telling the story that he has divine parentage. By the way, this kind of thing happens in the ancient world. The Roman emperors and others portray themselves as descended from divinity. And of course, when there's a mating between a god and a human, the first generation is almost always illegitimate, right? That's how these stories go. So all of that's kind of in that question. So he has, in verse 21, John has Jesus saying again, you know, where he's going, that they'll look for him, right? But in their wrongdoing, they're going to die. And that they're not going to be able to go where he's going to go. So Jesus gets asked if he's going to kill himself, right? And there's no scriptural basis that, you know, for saying don't kill yourself, right? That's not spelled out in the scriptures, but this was the prohibition that the Jews had developed. The most widespread religion, I'm going to call it religion, though it's philosophy. Philosophy in antiquity would be like religion today, and religion in antiquity would be like what most people call patriotism today, something like that. Stoicism, right? Stoicism is the most common philosophy of life. You know, how people live their lives is according to Stoicism. And the Stoics actually argued that if life would become too onerous, you could kill yourself, which is interesting because they thought that you had duty not only to family, but to country. And so I don't know what happens to that. That never really made sense to me. But there's some of, you know, this is sort of some of the background, right? The surrounding context for these stories. And so it's interesting too, in verse 24, Jesus calls himself, you know, I am. This is really provocative, right? He's going to say it a few times here, 2 or 3 times in a few lines.
Yes, talking about stoning.
That's right. Yeah, he's looking for a stoning. So in verse 28, he says it again, right? So Jesus said to them, when you lift up the Son of Mankind, then you'll realize that I am. And all the way at the end of the chapter, he says, before Abraham was, I am. Now, there's an interesting something going on here in verses 33 through 36, because Jesus says, you know, that he's going to set them free. And they answer, but we're the seed of Abram. We've never been anyone's slaves. What do you say to that, Ben?
Well, that is a funny statement, because it's like their whole national, you know, narrative is coming out of slavery from Egypt. And then there's multiple times in their history where they were taken into captivity in Babylon, right? And then now they are actually under Roman rule. So this idea that they were never slaves, I don't know. It's kind of semantic, right? Like, what's your definition of slave then, if you're going to say that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly where Rudin goes with this. She says, historically, she pointed out the same problems you pointed out. But then if they mean more absolutely, they've never been chattel slaves, right? So maybe it's something like that. But here's the thing. If Jesus has something to say here, he's the son, right? And so if he's the son, then he's the heir. And so it's going to become his house. And then he will have power to set slaves free, right?
Yeah.
That's how this works.
So these verses, I was a little bit confused as to the flow and maybe the direction of the discourse, because in verse 31, it starts off saying that he's talking to those who believe in him. But then by verse 38 in the discourse, he's talking to skeptics again and arguing with them. And it never says that he changes the people that he's talking with, because the people that are asking him questions are the people he's responding to. And again, in verse 31, it says that they're believers, but then at the very end, you can tell that they're not. So it's not clear to me what's really going on with the flow of the discourse here.
I don't know if this helps, Ben, but I'll say again, in verse 30, many trusted in him. In verse 31, he said to the Judeo who had come to trust him. So when you have a belief, it seems like this is it, right? Now I have a slogan. If anything comes up, I just say the slogan, right? But if you have trust, this is a little less absolute, right? It can sort of ebb and flow, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So people could trust him, but still be kind of having a philosophical or theological argument with him.
Yeah, I trust. Help me with my lack of trust, right? That's a paraphrase of the King James would be, right? I believe, help thou my unbelief.
Right.
Yeah. So that's one possible interpretation. And I always say, Ben, as the Muslim scholars do, the Islamic scholars, they have different opinions, right? There are different ways that we can read these texts. They respect each other's opinions, right? The scholars know I'm a scholar, you're a scholar, and yet we have a different reading. And in the end, they say, Wallahu alam, and God knows best. So I'll leave that at that. In verse 41, right? Before verse 41, you have that Jesus says he's doing the work of his Father. And then he says to his opponents in this argument, you're doing the work of your father, right? And who's their father? The slanderer.
The devil, yeah.
Right, the slanderer. And so that's what they're doing.
So slanderer is a false accuser, right? So that is sort of one subcategory or extra layer upon the accuser, right? So this is a sort of a subcategory of a Satan role.
Yeah, and we're getting here to a point where, by the end of, by verse 47, the Jews are understanding God's fatherhood symbolically, right? And so if Jesus is saying something more literal, then he is guilty of blasphemy, right? And according to Leviticus 24:13 through 15, the punishment would be stoning. So he's asking for it.
Yeah.
And they say to him, aren't you a Samaritan? And you have a demon in you? That's just, what do you make of that, Ben? That just seems like it comes out of nowhere.
Well, Samaritan, man, that's quite the slight. Derogatory.
Yeah, but it sounds like they think he is a Samaritan. I mean, to think he has a demon in him, that's commonplace, right? But why are they saying, aren't we right in saying that you're a Samaritan and you have a demon in you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back to their view of Samaritans is heretical, right? These are heretics, and so what Jesus is saying sounds heretical to them. So I think, they're going to just try to group him with that. Also, here in the book of John, he has gone to the Samaritans and preached to them, right? The woman at the well and so forth. That's part of the book of John. And so it's possible that they know of his, travels and teaching the Samaritans and are trying to identify him with that in order to discredit him.
Yeah. So, of course, they pick up stones to throw at him, but he slips away and he leaves the temple precinct. And that brings us to chapter 9. You know, in Jesus' time, Ben, most people only worked by natural light, right? So in the literature of the time, in late antiquity, Alexandrian school of literature, you had sort of this motif of the hyper-learned. And what do? They study late at night by lamplight.
Yeah.
And so you have here in verse 5, right? While I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. Now, this is in the context of the man born blind, right? And he's saying this to this man.
So yeah, a lot of the symbolism that's going on in this story or comes out of it in terms of Jesus's interaction with the religious authorities. Again, remember that all of the context of these is always interaction with religious authorities, and whether it's the woman taken in adultery or the man born blind and so forth. Here, the symbolism comes from the concept of light. And so obviously within the context of somebody who is blind, light, someone who sees and someone who doesn't see, right? The difference is light. And so that's where Jesus is taking this symbolism from and saying he's the light of the world.
And so he says this, he spits on the ground, makes some mud with the spit, and wipes the mud onto the man's eyes and tells him to go wash. And the rest is just one controversy after another, right? It's back and forth. How should I summarize this? Okay, isn't that the guy who was blind? Yeah, well, how is he not blind? And then they ask him and he tells them, no. They want to ask somebody else, or they want to hear the story again, and they keep, look, this is what happened. I'm telling you. Although his parents do seem to shy away a little bit from confessing, right?
Well, they believe he's lying, right? The way that you catch someone in a lie is to ask them the same question a little bit differently each time so that you get them to kind of change their story. Oh, I don't remember, exactly what I answered last time. And then you catch them in a lie because you have said that question different ways.
Wait, is that what they were doing? I've been interviewed by ICE on, returning from the Middle East. They call it interviewing. I call it interrogating.
Yeah.
And they made me miss my flight, man. They asked me the same question over and over. I said, look, you already asked me this question. My answer is not going to change. I'm going to miss my flight.
Yeah, that's how they try to catch people in lies, because if you say something that's inconsistent because the question's worded a little bit differently, then they can do that. So here they're trying to trip this guy up. They either think he's lying or they're trying to show that he's lying, even if maybe he is telling the truth. They're trying to confuse him. So this can be used both to get at the truth, but also this can be used in a harmful way, right? This can be weaponized to harm people who are just maybe not as quick on their wit, right? And can maybe misspeak. And then as soon as they misspeak, you can take advantage of their testimony. This is done in interrogations up until this day, right? This is used commonly.
As witnessed by my story.
Yep, exactly. So one of the elements here in the story that I think we could call funny is that they are so caught up on this idea that Jesus would heal somebody on the Sabbath that they're really concerned about the fact that he's not observing the Sabbath, not with the fact that he actually healed somebody, right? It's like it doesn't matter what good this guy does. It's like saying that it wouldn't matter how much good somebody does because they drink coffee, right? And if they drink coffee, it invalidates any good that they've ever done in their life.
Isn't that how it works?
Yeah. That's how it works. It cancels it all out, right?
Yeah.
And so again, they're just focused on this Sabbath thing. They get hung up on it because that's the only thing they can find, right? If it were something else, they'd go with something else.
I think, this story made me reflect on, I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I had a neighbor who was a Baptist preacher, and I was surprised, when we were talking, getting to know each other, and he was asking about my religion. I was asking about his religion. I'm a philosopher. He's a preacher, went to seminary. And so he mentions that the Sabbath isn't a thing for him. That's a Jewish thing, he says. we're not Jews, we're Christians. I thought, wait, what? I thought Christians kept the Sabbath holy. I thought it was one of the 10 Commandments, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess he thought of that as Pharisaical, maybe?
Yeah. Looks at it differently.
Something like that. So it's interesting too. I wanted to point out in verses 24 and 25 that they're saying that the blind man is a sinner, right?
Yes.
This is, again, a wrongdoer. I mean, it's just this term, right? What is this sinner term mean? Is this someone who's unjust, is what we usually mean by unrighteous? What's actually translating maybe more literally unjust, and here, sinner, someone who's somehow a wrongdoer, who's making some kind of mistake.
Yeah, they do this again in verse 34. They tell him he was born entirely in sins, right? Like saying you aren't able to make a judgment about this man. You can't say whether he's good or whether he healed you. Everything you're saying is a lie because you were born blind. Therefore, your parents or you sinned. And so the entire life and family and everything that you come from is sinful. And so we can't believe any of it, right? Again, this is probably a straw man type of thing that the book of John is putting upon these accusers, right? That it isn't clear that this was actually a genuine argument made by them, but it does portray a type of mentality that was existent within the culture, that these types of maladies, again, the being blind and so forth, were caused by sin in some way. And that's how the story starts out, right? The disciples ask, who sinned that this man would be born blind? And Jesus says, oh no, that this isn't the result of sin, right? What this is an opportunity for us to show the power of God.
Yeah, and it's important, to point out that these people that Jesus is healing, whether they be blind or lame or lepers, as they're called in the King James Bible, going back to the story of Apollonius of Tyana, people like the beggar in that story were kept around, right? So that they would be handy for scapegoating, right? So all of these people are at risk somehow of that.
They're fodder.
Yeah. So, and another thing is that this, another reading of the verses you were just talking about, is they're questioning, whether they're questioning his paternity, right? They're suggesting that he may be a bastard.
So the statement that he was born in sin, the implication in there is that he is illegitimate.
One
possible thing there.
Implication,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Judeo asked Jesus if he's saying they're blind, right? The Pharisees we're not blind, are we? Jesus says to them, if you were blind, you wouldn't be in the wrong.
Yeah.
But as it is, because you say we can see, you're stuck in your wrongdoing. Isn't that how it goes? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. If you really didn't understand what you were saying, and you were saying, we don't understand, then there would be a way to teach you, and you wouldn't be guilty of XYZ, of all of these accusations and things that you're doing, because you could be teachable and you would be able to change your mind and repent. But you're saying you don't need to change your mind at all. You've got it. You understand it all perfectly, and you know exactly the way it is. You see perfectly. Therefore, you can't repent. Like he says, your sin remaineth, right? You can't change your mind if you know that you're 100% right.
Yeah. I think I can relate this back to, Ben. I don't know if this is the intent of the author, but I think I can relate this back to the stoning story and the comparison I made with the story of Apollonius of Tyana. And that's because, again, for the scapegoating mechanism to work, people have to, they can't know that that's what they're doing. If they knew, then it wouldn't work.
They have to, in a sense, be in that mob mentality, right? Detached from the actual reflective thinking about the actual action. And rather, they're just in sort of autopilot mode, right? They're just following, going with the flow, rather than actually making their own decisions and choices based on what they truly believe. And that's what Jesus is inviting them to do. He's like, okay, if you truly believe this, do it. And when they reflect on it, they realize they don't truly believe that. That's not the way they really want to, play out the law, so to speak. And so they're not going to do it. But you have to, in a sense, be detached from your belief or your truly deeply held understanding and act in a way that isn't in accordance with that. And so it's kind of like an instinctual or mob mentality type of thing.
Yeah.
Instinctual is probably not the right word. I would say impulsive.
Yeah, that is a better word. So that brings us to chapter 10, Ben, where we have what's it called?
You could call it a parable.
Right. It's a story, right? The story of the Good Shepherd.
Yeah, I mean, it does sort of match as a parable, but it's it's analogy or a metaphor or, it could be an allegory, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so in verse 6, we get that Jesus gave them this analogy, but they didn't understand what he was saying to them. Now, I just want to pause here a moment, Ben, because I thought again, we all know this story. We all know what it means. But if you pause and think about it, ask yourself, do I really understand what's going on here? Why would he say this? Right? How does this actually apply to human beings? Right? We're not sheep. What's going on here? Then I thought, okay, I don't know why he's saying this either. Right? But I think what we can say, and this harks back to the 23rd Psalm, right? It is a typical characterization for a leader in that time, right? It's the same kind of, it's commonplace, right, among early Middle Eastern leaders. And their staffs, right, that they have are weapons and tools, just like the shepherds carry. So it's about leadership, put it that way.
Right. There's deeper symbolism here. Also in relation to, the allusion would be to David, who was a shepherd, right? And Jesus is supposed to be, quote unquote, son of David, or his successor, right? His heir. And so there's some of that going on too.
So we have a thief here in verse 10, Ben. Sometimes we'll have to go underneath some of these words translated thief, right? Because the people crucified, the two men crucified next to Jesus, right? They were called thieves too. But there are these major rebellions that happen, right? And there are these people that they sort of live on the outskirts and they come and raid. They're not just common thieves.
Brigands?
Yeah.
Is the word that we often use for that kind of thing.
Right. That would be a good way to put it. And I can't help but think of the Gadianton robbers from the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's going to go all the way with this analogy, right? And he's going to tell us that he would lay down his life for the sheep. Look, if you're hired, that's different from if you're the son who's going to inherit the flock, right? These are as good as yours. You have a vested interest, right? And then I wanted to point out too that when Jesus says, I have other sheep that don't belong to this yard, I need to lead those too, and they'll listen to my voice, and they'll all become one flock with one shepherd. The standard Latter-day Saint interpretation would be, oh, this is the people in the Americas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I have here in a footnote, Christianity was a multi-ethnic religion spreading through much of the Roman Empire, right? So that's the context in which this is said.
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is that, again, like other gospels, we're talking about more than just the Jewish people, or more even than just the Israelite people that Jesus is wanting to get his message out to.
And so then we have the people saying he has a demon in him. Why are you listening to him? Others say these aren't the statements of someone possessed by a demon. A demon can't open the eyes of the blind, right? And so you have a festival going on. This is a rededication of the temple. I think King James says dedication, but I think the reason, Rudin says rededication is because you have it's a Maccabean rededication of the temple.
Yeah, this is Hanukkah.
Yeah, it's Hanukkah. Yeah. So it's been profaned by Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century. And so Jesus is walking around the temple precinct. I think the text actually says something very specific like that. Well, it mentions the portico of Solomon. But I just wanted to point out, I don't think I've mentioned this before, Ben. Oftentimes we hear of Jesus being is it in the temple or at the temple, whatever it is, King James translation is saying. But the point is, the temple, it probably means the things that Jesus is doing in these stories. He's not in the temple. He's in the temple precinct. So that would be like being on the grounds of the temple in Latter-day Saint temple context.
The actual building of the temple with a roof is pretty small, right? And only the priests go in there to burn the incense, do the sacrifices, so forth, right? The temple courtyard area and the precinct is, more of an open air place.
Yeah, and I'm suggesting he's not even in the courtyard, right? He's in a place in the temple precinct on the outside of that, where even women can be, as we've seen, right? And in some of these stories, and so that's just something I wanted to bring up because I don't think I've mentioned it before. Oftentimes, when we see that Jesus is at the temple, we shouldn't think of him as not only not in the innermost part where only the priests are, but not even in the inner courtyard, just outside in the general vicinity of the temple, let's say.
Yeah, not being a Levite, he wouldn't have ever actually gone inside the temple, like the place with the roof, right? He wouldn't have ever actually gone inside of it.
Right. So in this case, he's walking around the temple precinct in the portico of Solomon. So this is on the eastern side of the temple's outer court. This is the outer court. It's a public place. Even women can be there. It's named after Solomon, but the original temple was built in the 10th century, the one that was attributed to him. This is actually Herod's temple from 6th century. And then we get the famous statement of Jesus in verse 30, Ben. I and the Father are one being, is one way to put it, right? The Father and I are one.
Yeah, how many theological arguments do we have over this?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you want to take this as just a pragmatic analogy, as Rudin puts it, then again, the Son has equal material interest with the Father. Remember, he's going to inherit, so that's one way to think about it.
Yeah, the Latter-day Saint take on this is often stated as one in purpose. So yeah, this I and my Father are one, as the King James puts it. Obviously, the Jews take this as blasphemy. And again, we've said this multiple times, but when you say the Jews, we're talking about the religious authorities. We're not talking about all of the people in general. We're talking about a subset of people who would have been there antagonizing Jesus, right? And they see this as blasphemy. So that's why in 31, we see them taking up stones to cast at him.
But see, now Jesus says, I love this answer. Hasn't it been written in your law? I said, you are gods.
Yeah.
And so where's he getting that from? I think we can say Psalms 82:6, right? There's something like that in Psalms 82:6.
Yeah, that would come out of Psalms, which I thought was interesting when he says your law, because that would be the Torah, which isn't Psalms.
That's right.
And so if, maybe you can look at the Greek here, but if he means by your law, if the specific reference is here to the Torah, then that's not in the Torah, right? That's in Psalms.
That's right. Yeah. But John doesn't really know his Judaism, right? He's a Christian. The author of this text is a Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea here, when he says law, what he means is scriptures, right? Because then later in the next verse, he says the scripture cannot be broken, right? So yeah, you're right.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because going back to Psalm 82:6, you do get something like this. And yet the very next verse, and this is how it goes, right? Back to, the whatever verse of the Quran says this. Okay, but what does the next verse say, right? Nobody ever reads the next verse.
Yeah.
The next verse kind of brings us back to, the distance between deity and mortals in Jewish thought. So they read, I say, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nonetheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. You also have a verse in Exodus 7:1 that says, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh.
So the idea here is that Jesus is saying, hey, the scriptures say something like this, you are gods, and you don't call them blasphemous. So you shouldn't get after me so quickly or easily because I'm using the same type of language.
Right.
Yeah, so chapter 10 here ends with Jesus kind of making the same kind of statement and argument, so to speak, in a little bit of a legalistic way about his identity, and that they're not accepting it even though there's witnesses, and the witnesses are him and his works. Right? Earlier he said, "Why are you stoning me? For which of all the good works that I've done?" Right? These are demonstrative of my identity and power. And if you knew God, you would know that he's testifying of me as well. So these are the witnesses. So Jesus is kind of making these statements to them, trying to establish his identity. And the fact that they're not accepting it, for John, is evidence of their wickedness, evidence of their inability to see, just like we talked about with the blind man. They don't have the light.
And that's that.
Thank you, Christopher. Yeah, we want to say thanks also again to all that participate in the Latter-day Peace Studies project, and our editors, especially Kyle and Michael, that have helped us out so much. And thank you, Christopher, for all that you do, all the research you do, and thoughts that you bring into this. The Rene Girard stuff was really neat this time to really dig into some of those concepts. So you do that a lot, and it's really great.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for doing this with me. I couldn't do it without you. I know you did it without me once. I couldn't do it without you.